Cool. Welcome to this PIPS speaker event. We are welcoming Simon DeDeo here. Simon is an assistant professor in the social decision science at Carnegie Mellon, also an external professor at Santa Fe Institute, and runs the Laboratory for Social Minds. I would say, and Simon, you tell me whether you think that seems right. You seem to me like a prime example of a physicist turned social scientist. And I think we'll get some examples of what this could look like in the talk today. So yeah, Simon's talk is titled Satisfying Explanations and Meaningful Arguments, New Results in the Theory and Practice of Human Epistemology. So I think we'll hear about the role of explanations, maybe things about what makes for good explanations, what are the underlying structures that define human preferences for explanations and justifications. Yeah, this is sort of embedded in sort of, as I understand it, Simon's larger research interests that have to do with understanding human and civilizational progress, and how like human behavior, cognition, and decision-making relates to this at different timescales using different methodologies. And yeah, this had produced some, according to me, pretty interesting research that I've been interested to reading about and then today also hearing. So yeah, thank you again very much, Simon. And yeah, to you now.
Excellent. Thank you, Nora, and thanks everyone for coming. Let me just, I'm going to put you guys so I can see like this grid view of everybody. So please do feel free to jump in and ask questions as you like. My goal here is to communicate some of the stuff we're doing in the lab at Carnegie Mellon and Santa Fe Institute. And also just to give you a sense of how one person or really a group of people, lots of people implicated in this research, how we've tried to approach the questions of how humans reason, how they make sense of the world, and the ways they do that both internally. So I'll talk about the internal experience of reasoning, of thinking, of theorizing, of, in particular, explaining, and then how they do that socially. So how people interact, because of course, I mean, there's a reason that we spend a lot of money to bring people into contact with each other. It's not enough for us to think on our own. We spend a lot of time thinking with others, and that shift from the internal experience of making sense of things to the social experience of making sense of things with others and companionship with others is, I think, one of the major transitions. If I think about how society works, you might think that a lot of what we do, a lot of our mental technologies fall into one of these two baskets. They're either new ways to reason about the world, or they're new technologies to link us together and enable us to reason together better. So if you think about something like the scientific method, some parts of the scientific method are really internal. They're accounts of, for example, how we ought to interact with cause, when we ought to feel satisfied with an experiment and when not. But other aspects of the scientific revolution are things that we might think of as like institutions. So something like peer review, for example, is a way in which we adjudicate how our reasoning together is happening, right? To get something into a journal is a public act with public rules and not simply a private thing, right? Sadly, no matter how compelling your internal experience of rightness is, it's probably insufficient to get you published. My air conditioning has now, my heat pump, this is like a very scientific moment here. My heat pump is failing, so I'm going to turn this off again. Hang on a sec. So.
I wonder if John has any opinions on heat pumps or air conditioners that he wants to share.
So, all right, very good. So, so I'm going to talk. This talk comes in two pieces: explanation making, the internal experience, you might say, of satisfying explanations, and then the public aspect of argument making. So you might think of argument making as I think something and I want to get Nora to share my point of view. I want to stick my thoughts in her head in a way that is like at least mildly consensual, right? I won't be focusing on like mimetic bombs, but rather a sort of philosophical angle into argument making where we have a sense of public reason giving. A lot of this grew up, I was thinking about this actually this morning, like, well, how did I end up so obsessed by these questions? One answer is this is beautiful. Hang on, let me just click here. This beautiful book by David Deutsch. It's now about 10 years old, called The Beginning of Infinity. It's his second book. And Deutsch really emphasizes the role of, we use the same phrase, the role of explanation making, the ways in which we explain things. And one of the big points that he is after is the idea that things like, for example, prediction are not what drove our progress as a species, right? The reason we can build air conditioners is not because we began by getting really good at predicting the temperatures of gases, right? It was because, in fact, by contrast, we got really good at explaining those surface level phenomena. The accuracy of the prediction was far less important than the underlying explanatory practices. So that's one reason. I was very inspired by this. It was a couple of years ago. I was like, it was like 10 years ago. I was like really depressed, and I was like at a conference. I was in Vienna, and I happened to pick up Deutsch's book, and I was like, oh my God, like, thank God I feel good about my life again. So it's a wonderful book. If you ever feel like, you need, like, if you're feeling sad, like, buy this book. And the other place that this began was, I was talking with a woman who was a graduate student at the time at CMU, Debbie Borg. And so Debbie is a mathematician, logician. And I was making fun of Debbie, and I was like, look, Debbie, like, you guys, like, you mathematicians, you're nuts, right? Because you spend all your time proving things that you know are true. Right? This is like a scientist, as a physicist or as a biologist, right? Doing an experiment where you know with almost complete certainty what the outcome is going to be is a terrible way to do experiments. Like, you should be doing experiments on the things that you're uncertain about. But if you look at all of the mathematics that people do, like the highest status proofs, like you want to win life, right? Prove that P is not equal to MP. Well, I have a secret to tell you, P is not equal to MP. Like, I already know that, all right? We all kind of know that. And so I was like, Debbie, like, what's the point? Like, we already know, right? Like, is this just like pure signaling? Like, you're all just nerd warring it out. Like, what's the point? And she's like, no, look, grow up. Really, what's going on, when we prove P not equal to MP, a lot of really interesting things are going to happen cognitively for us as mathematicians. And in particular, one of the things she said was that we believe that proof, when we find it, will link together areas of mathematics in ways that will illuminate mathematics as a whole. And this idea that what we're after here is not just truth, but illuminating truth. That stuck with me, and I spent a lot of time with Debbie being like, can we build a model of like what mathematicians were trying to do and compare it to physicists? Anyway, so those are two pieces. That's kind of the celebratory aspect of thinking about explanations. The other aspect of explanation making that became particularly compelling to me was eventually I went back online. Like, I was online in the 90s, and then I went back online in like 2010, and it was a nightmare. And what I realized is that people are explaining things to each other now, but they're not just, doing David Deutsch, Debbie Borg, like Ben Franklin. This is Ben Franklin here. If you spent any time in the American educational system, you will know the legend of Ben Franklin. We'll get to him. But what happens, like, you go online and people are explaining things to each other there. Like, there's these memes on Twitter, right? Like, tell me how the universe works. Don't dumb it down or I'll kill you, right? People love explaining things, and yet sometimes, right, this stuff goes wrong. And so I also became interested in the idea that this was a double-edged sword. So the human drive for explaining things, the way in which we have tastes for different kinds of explanations, can also lead us into very strange, maladaptive pathways of behavior. So that's kind of the big picture here. I'm going to talk about great successes in explaining, and I'm going to talk about great fails of explaining. So let's get a little bit deeper here. What do we mean as cognitive scientists? Like, we're in cognitive science. What do we mean about with explanation? So one way to think of it, and I've used this phrase before, is we can think of explanation as a form of sense making. So I take this phrase from a wonderful paper by Nick Chater and George Lowenstein a couple of years ago. They called it the underappreciated drive for sense making. Different forms of sense making. So you might think of narrative sense making. So oftentimes we make sense of our lives through, for example, reading novels or watching TV or listening to stories. One of the things we've been interested in the lab is how people write fan fiction. What we're doing there is we're bringing some kind of sense to life through the mechanisms of plot and character, right? So that's one form of sense making. Another form of sense making, you might call it like decision making, right? I'm going to make sense of the world by acting. And this is kind of maybe an active inference, kind of Carl Friston sense of sense making, where like the world doesn't make sense. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to make my bed. That's going to make sense of my world, but notice that that's a kind of active engagement with the world, right? My life makes no sense. Okay, what am I going to do? Like I'm going to, take some Adderall and like write computer code. Or my life makes no sense. What am I going to do? I'm going to go hike a mountain, right? So we have narrative sense making, like the world doesn't make sense. Okay, like maybe I'm Thor in the Marvel movie, right? Decision making sense, like sense making through action, right? That's another kind of like ordering principle we impose. What I'm going to think about here is a certain kind of sense making that we think of as explanatory sense making. So this is a retrospective act, right? We explain why things are the way they are. Right? It's not forward looking. It's not like we're going to make sense of the world by ordering it into the future. One of the wonderful things about sense making is that this seems to be a mental or even neural act that goes all the way down to the visual system. So if you look at these images here, right, like look at image B, right? So if you are, I don't know, I always worry because some of these images, like they're diagnostic of like mental disorders, right? So if you don't see this, like, don't call your doctor. I'm not qualified to diagnose you. But like, if you look at the image B, right, I see a spiky ball, right? So what's my brain doing there, right? In one sense, all I've shown you is a bunch of triangles terminating in different arcs of different shapes, right? Some of the arcs are concave, some of them are convex. And your brain's like, what the fuck is this? I want to make sense of this. And so in fact, what happens is very higher order set of reasoning processes kick in. They're higher order, but they're not conscious, right? You can't unsee this spiky ball. Like I can't put you in a culture where the spiky ball does not look like a spiky ball to you. We've checked this out actually, so you can take visual illusions of this sense-making form. You go to different cultures, everyone's got it. You don't have to grow up in a world of wireframe objects. You can grow up in the jungle, you see the same things, right? So this kind of sense-making act is really basic to human cognition. And one of the things, well, I don't work on the visual system. I work on sort of higher order processes where instead of visual stimuli, for example, we might get stimuli, quote unquote, from our lives in the world. We might get stimuli from, fact, like we read some book, right? And it's, oh, there's some facts in the book. And I'm trying to put these facts together with facts in like another book, right? Or, I have experimental results or I have things coming off of dials, really highly refined, culturally contextual objects. But you can see here what's going on is that explanation, at least this idea of sense making, retrospective factual sense making, is something that's kind of baked in pretty deep down in the human cortex. It may be one of the reasons we're so good at it, and it may also be, as we'll see, one of the ways to understand why we make sense of culture or like culturally contextual phenomena in the way we do may in some ways derive from how we make sense of far more basic things that are millions of years old in our evolutionary history. Right? So explanation, one thing I should say, I don't know, I was trying to kind of reverse engineer you guys. And I was like, oh, I bet there's a lot of AI people here, right? So we're gonna go through this. It doesn't seem to be the case. But one thing to be really clear about, right? Explanation is not prediction. I suggested this a little bit, right? Explanation is retrospective. It looks backward. It's this old joke, right? Prediction is hard, especially about the future, right? Explanations are retrospective. With prediction, here's like, you want to know what prediction is? Here's like a good definition, right? Given the data I have to hand, given my experiences, given all the sensory information or the CSVs that are coming off the internet, how well can I predict or guess what's going to happen next, right? So prediction is hard, but in a certain sense, it's actually easy. And it's easy in the sense that you know when you've done it right? So prediction markets, for example, like they settle, right? We know as long as you're clear enough about what the event is you're predicting, as long as you're clear enough about like the goodness function, right? So are you minimizing mean squared error, or, right? As long as you're clear about it, you say like in the end, we all say we make predictions and, the stock market's going to be X, and we all go through and it's like, okay, like who won, right? So the task is difficult, but the assessment is easy. Explanation, much, much harder. So in one sense, we can all explain, right? It's like the old joke, right? I give you a story about the world, explain it. You can explain it very well. Then I'm like, aha, I tricked you. Actually, the opposite happened. And you're like, oh, I can explain that too, just as easily. The task of explanation, given the data I have to hand, how well can I explain what happened in the past? The problem here is that when we come to weigh explanations one against the other, we often end up with what you might think of as competing values, right? So I might say, okay, Harry, that's great. That's a great explanation. Really simple, succinct, right? The Jews did it, but it doesn't fit the facts very well, right? I get it sort of kind of hits a couple things, right? But it's like, there's things it can't account for. Your explanation's missing things, right? But the flip side, of course, right, is that you go to somebody else, and you go to Mary, and Mary, it's a great explanation, and you really nailed everything that's happened, but this is so baroque and over the top and complicated. Could it be simpler, possibly? This kind of value spectrum here, since Nora mentioned I'm the physicist who went into social science, right? It's like, the physicist has always got the uber simple explanation that doesn't fit the facts, and the biologist can fit every single fact, and you've forgotten the explanation by the time it's finished, right? Because it's so large. So first thing, prediction, not explanation. The second thing I'd say is that explanations are really everywhere. So I'm going to talk about explanations at different scales. But one of the things that we can see is that our lives are kind of suffused by explaining. We sometimes sort of recreationally explain. As scientists, we kind of overdose on explanations like, why do the stars shine, right? But explanations go from these kind of centuries-long tasks we're all collaboratively trying to explain, where life comes from. But they go all the way down to sort of the microsecond, second by second evolution of human life, right? Like something's happened, I'm walking down the street and someone looks at me and I might be like, I want to explain that, right? Why did this person look at me? I was walking down the street, right? Sorry, I see, I have a question from Daniel. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I was thinking more about the previous slide. I'm wondering, would it be consistent with your view to say that even though explanation is not prediction, the reason we have explanation is to make successful predictions about other stuff? So they might not be the exact same activity, but I'm thinking I observe some stuff, I look for a good explanation, which is maybe some idea about what generated that, and then I can use that for the future. If I'm wondering why did she look at me, maybe I want to know, is it because she hates me or because she wants to talk to me or whatever, and that can guide my actions in the future and make predictions about what would happen supposing I were to talk to her or walk away from her.
Absolutely. I think that's an aspect of it, right? That often good explanations help make good predictions. Interestingly, we'll have some time to talk about this. We sometimes care about which predictions the explanation gets right. So for example, an explanation that helps predict something you didn't have in mind when you built the explanation, we often value those much more. So it's a kind of you can think of that if you're, kind of a CS type, right? That's out of sample, cross-validation, right? So there's certainly connections there. That said, we spend a lot of time explaining things where there's no clear prediction, right? Walking down the street, one walks by, why did she look at me, right? I'm never going to see that woman again in New York, right? I'm never going to see that woman again. The explanation I build, it might guide my behavior, but it's going to be very hard to connect the quality of that explanation to any particular prediction that happens later, right? It might help me make sense of, she looked at me because I was being weird, right? Perhaps. And then I might think, well, I don't know, maybe if I stop being so weird, people won't be looking at me all the time, right? But the distance between those two things is really large, right? Another thing I'd say is we spend an enormous amount of time trying to explain things where prediction is really we want to explain, for example, historical events. To a certain extent, we think that a good explanation will help us in the future, but nobody thinks, for example, that a good explanation of why World War II went the way it did will help us predict with any degree of resolution what's going to happen in the Ukraine right now, right? That said, we have a sense that understanding World War II, having good and understanding here understood as explaining, might help us get there. right? So I think there's, it's like if I were talking to Google, right, and they're like, why do we care about explanation? I might try and pitch it like, a machine that can explain things, maybe, good at predicting who's going to click on the ad. That said, if you have a prediction goal in mind, you should probably just go and predict it, right? As opposed to do it. Maybe a little bit deeper here, Daniel, is, why do we even have this desire to explain it at all? Like, why did evolution give us the desire to explain? One answer might be it helps our fitness, but it helps our fitness, meaning it gives us greater control over nature. Yeah. But it may also be, for example, a social thing. Like a lot of explanations we do have a very strong moral component. Like, why did you fail the student? Well, I failed the student because they deserved it, right? And what the argument I'm making there is an argument that's about what we think of as the right way to behave. Right. So moral explanation, I won't really talk too much about moral explanation here, but I think a lot of the principles come in play. So for example, what makes for a satisfying, let's say, scientific explanation may also make for a satisfying moral explanation, even though, unless you're trying to predict who's going to heaven, there's not really a prediction component to moral explaining. So thank you. That's great then. That's great. All right. So I mentioned, okay, we have some theories here. So I'm going to give you a crash course in some work that I did with Zach Walchowicz, who's now a graduate student, or sorry, a postdoc at Harvard University in economics. So he's one of these kind of genius types who goes between psych and econ and actually CS. So he did a master's as well in machine learning. So Zach and I were interested. Zach, we both got addicted kind of simultaneously to this question of explanation, why explanation works, and we decided, all right, let's see if we can get a sort of high-level mathematical account of this task of how we value explaining, right? So we have lots of psychological evidence, in this context or that context, people prefer this explanation to that explanation, but can we sort of unify all those disparate empirical results with some framework? So we sit down and we did a kind of Bayesian model, right? So the joke here, right? Bayes' theorem, like, are the first advance in AI, automated reasoning. We say, okay, look, when people judge the quality of an explanation, what they're doing fundamentally is, and this is this is one of these like lies that's kind of true, right? The electron is not a bowling ball, but like, let's pretend and see how far we get, right? What if people, when they said, ooh, good explanation, right? Like, I think that's right. What are they doing? Well, one thing they might be doing, one way to cash it out is to say what they're doing is, given the evidence they have to hand, how likely, how probable is that explanation? So how do you evaluate that? Magically, you should actually go read Bayes' original paper. It's in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. It's an amazing paper. It goes on for like 40 pages and it's stunning. Like, he gets it all and then we forget it for like 200 years. So how do you evaluate this? Well, what you do is turns out you flip it around and you say, actually, there's two components. When I say, how likely is this explanation to be true given the evidence, it actually breaks into two pieces. First of all, how likely is the evidence given the explanation, and how likely is the explanation before any of the evidence came in? Like, how does that explanation feel before any information comes in, right? So all the stuff that goes into the green box, we refer to those as empirical values. So the way in which we sort of get the number in the green box, like, that's going to be influenced by this thing we call empirical values. And everything that goes into the blue box, we call those theoretical values, right? So in fact, it so turns out, and I can show you this on the next slide, the empirical values decompose into two pieces. One empirical value is how well can this explanation predict any particular fact in question? That's one aspect. And secondly, how well does that explanation link facts together? So one thing you can say is, okay, here's a bunch of things that happened. Here's your explanation. Well, pick one of the things that happened. How likely is that thing to have happened given the explanation? Okay, that's how well can I account for any particular fact? And the second aspect of this empirical value is what you might think of as the partial mutual information, meaning the extent to which one fact depends upon another, the extent to which this thing happening raises or lowers the probability of another aspect of the phenomena happening. So that's the empirical values. The theoretical values we decompose fundamentally into two pieces. One is how much does this explanation resemble explanations that I've liked in the past. And the second kind of mysterious thing that we'll dig into in a moment, how simple, how concise, how succinct is this explanation? So this is a kind of complicated thing that needs to be unfolded, right? Simplicity is complex. The way we cashed it out in the paper itself, we had to come up with a simple definition of simple. Our simple definition of simple was succinctness. How quickly can you say it, right? So even like more simply, how many words does it take to say, right? So that's one way to cash it out. And of course, there's many kind of subtleties there. So here's kind of how the mathematics looks at sort of the series of steps here. We want to say, okay, like I'm explaining something to Nora. Is she going to reject it or accept it? Or is she going to like sign on to somebody else's explanation? I want to answer that question. Well, here's the story. Nora secretly, her brain is kind of running this computation. And what she's interested in is the probability that the explanation is true, given all the stuff she knows. And then you can break this literally with just a bit of algebra, break this into two pieces, the posterior and the prior, we call it, right? And then in fact, the posterior breaks into two pieces. You can think of, we call this descriptiveness and co-explanation. And then the prior decomposes into what we think of as the domain-dependent prior. And then this magical term we call simplicity. And a lot of what we're interested in is how people perceive that final piece, that simplicity piece. Simon McGee, I see you have your hand up, so please jump in if you like.
Oh, thank you. So this actually raises a question that I've been thinking about posting into chat, which is when you talk about explanations, how high level do you take them to be? So do they have to be verbally articulable? Do they have to be accessible to conscious reflection? Right? Does the bacteria construct explanations, or do only professors of cognitive science construct explanations?
This is great, Simon. So I mean, sort of going back to the early part of the talk, when I'm like, look at this spiky ball, right? The claim there is that your brain is explaining something, but at a really pre-conscious level, right? It's not that you're looking at the circles and triangles and being like, ooh, what could this be? And then you're reasoning it out, right? It's a very pre-conscious act, right? Yeah. The stuff we're interested here that I'm particularly interested in is the stuff accessible to consciousness, right? Stuff where we're sort of aware of what's going on, or at least we're aware that there's something that we don't have an explanation for and we're trying to get one. We may be aware of the pieces that are going into it. At the same time, however, part of the claim here is that we're not quite aware of how those pieces are fitting together, how those pieces are driving, let's say, a feeling of satisfaction that comes out the other end. There's a lot of great stuff. Actually, there's two great papers. One by Alison Gopnik, who does a lot of stuff on child development, but she has a paper called Explanation as Orgasm. And I remember Zach and I were like, can we cite this paper? It's like the title is too good. But I think that gives this sense of the extent to which explanation is a conscious act, but there's definitely stuff that's out of your control, right? There's aspects of explanation making that are, to a certain extent, exceed our abilities to handle them. So I'm not sure, Simon, is that helpful? Just giving you a sense of
somewhat. Yeah. So I guess you've mentioned that your measure of simplicity of an explanation is how many words it takes to write it down. It seems to me that there might be situations in which I'm consciously able to interact with an explanation, but I can't articulate it, but I can convey it by pointing.
I love it. That's a wonderful, that's just a great thought. I want to think more about that. What you're asking about is like, what about these, let's call them liminal explanations, things that are sort of there, right? So for example, like, I'm sure you've been in this situation, right? Like, I don't know, you're at the train station, they're like, look, we can't give you a refund. And you're like, why? And you're asking for an explanation, like, explain to me why you can't give me a refund. And the guy at the ticket counter says, well, that's just the way it is. And you're like, that's not an explanation. But you get this feeling the guy is like, I just explained it to him, right? And he has this feeling that he's explained it. Like there's some sense, right? He's gesturing at something, but it would probably take a lot of psychoanalysis or like David Graeber books or something to really unfold what he thinks he's done there, right? So that sense of like the person, when he says that's just the way it is, he feels like, oh, that's a really succinct explanation. Why is, Simon still kind of irate at the ticket counter? really, actually, the way he hasn't explained it, or at least the actual explanation is much, much deeper, right? And his explanation for why you're not getting a refund is probably something like, look, the way society works is such and such a way, and people like you have to give in at certain points for everything to go along and get along. And like, I don't know, right? Try to unfold that unfold that false consciousness is a task of a lifetime. The other paper I mentioned, Alison Gopnik, the other paper that might be fun is by an old friend of mine. We went to college together. He's at the University of Utah now. T. Nugent, C.T. Nugent, we called him T. So T has a wonderful paper about how we're misled by succinctness, right? So, we sometimes have this false feeling that something has been explained simply because the explanation is so short, right? So that might be another situation in which we're kind of gesturing at something, but we're not quite sure what's at the other end of our finger. And it's almost like the fluency of the gesture is substituting for the cognitive act of understanding. So I'm not sure, Simon, if that speaks to you. I'm going to think about your question further. I see, just so we make sure you get, Aurora, I see your hand is up as well.
You got my name right.
Well, you have explained how to pronounce it.
I just want to make sure I understand what we're trying to do with a model like this, which is very interesting. I really like it.
Yeah.
Are we trying to make a normative claim, like this is what a good explanation should be? Or are we trying to make a claim about, or trying to make a descriptive claim about the way that people actually reason?
We're being descriptive here. And philosophers are in the normative business. It seems probably philosophically incoherent to say, I'm going to give you an explanation of what good explanations are, because if you think about it for about 25 seconds, like, how do I evaluate the quality of that explanation prior to your theory of explanation? So there's, it's a bit of silliness there. I'm going to get into normative material in a moment, because I think we can all agree, like, as they say on the internet, like, I fucking love science. Like, science, certain forms of science, they work extraordinarily well. So let's take a look at them. We also have a sense of, like, some explanations they've gone wrong for people. So we can get into a normative world a little bit, but I'm going to kind of withhold judgment, right? So, I'm like that awful, professor who's like, everything is valid, right? So, Newton is valid and like QAnon is valid. Like, that's kind of the perspective. But we want to understand what's going on, right? So I'm going to, go on, Aura. Yeah, sorry.
Well, the reason I ask, because starting with Bayes' theorem,
yeah,
implies that you're looking for something optimal, and then working backwards from there in the way that you're constructing this theory.
Right. Bayes' theorem is, it's optimal in one sense, right? From the Cox axioms, right? If you want to reason consistently in a certain fashion, this is the only way to do it, right? But consistency is not truth, right? So, you might, like, QAnon, sadly, is extraordinarily consistent, right? Let's say, right? And if you don't think QAnon's, I used to be in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Like, Santa Fe, like, there are really consistent, crazy people, right? And they are, in one sense, they may very well be perfect Bayesians, right? So, Bayes, you might think of Bayes' rule as producing, like, if you want to play a certain game, here's how to play it consistently. The relationship between playing that game consistently and getting to the truth, that is much more fraught, right? It is true. So if you look at this, right, if you take a look at the screen here, I've got these blocks here. I've got 2 blue boxes and 2 red boxes. If you want to be a good Bayesian, right, you should weight all of these terms equally. So for example, like descriptiveness and co-explanation, you're only a Bayesian if you take those 2 terms and add them together. If you multiply one of them, if you double one of them, right, you're going to be overvaluing, let's say, co-explanation. And by the way, I think that's what's happening with QAnon. You're going to be overvaluing a certain thing. Now you might be like, you're overvaluing it compared to the normative standard of Bayesianism. And I want to be like, well, like, I'd rather be, correct than consistent, right? So it's not necessarily the case that being a good Bayesian is going to get you there. The nice thing is that you can see these things shifting. We do play games. So Tanya Lombroso and her team at Princeton have kind of teased this out a little bit. And you can see people violating the Bayesian standard, right? So you can see people overvaluing co-explanatory explanations, what we would call co-explanatory explanations, right? So the simple example, I'll just do this quickly and then we'll we'll jump into more fun things in a moment, or rather different fun things. So Tanya, for example, gives experimental subjects. She's like, all right, look, there are these aliens, right? Aliens get sick, right? And like, there's disease A, and if the aliens get disease A, they get a runny nose. And there's disease B, which is like, if they get disease B, like they get spots, and like diseases A and B are like super, super common, right? And then there's this very rare disease, disease C, that gives you both the runny nose and spots, right? And then they're like, all right, here's an alien, he's got runny nose and spots, and everyone's like, disease C. And you're like, actually, no, right? Like the base rates for A and B are so high that probably this alien just has, if we're going to play this game, right, it just has A and B. But people love this explanation that kind of simultaneously takes care of two bits of data. It makes the runny nose dependent upon the spots, conditional upon having disease C, right? If you have a runny nose, you're likely to have the spots. So people are kind of overvaluing that, and like, Tanya and the gang, they can like turn knobs, they can change the base rates, and they can even start to measure the deviations from Bayesianism. So that pushes a little bit at the normative question.
Can I ask a question there on that?
Yeah, of course, Daniel, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, I understand like that's what humans do, but you could say that that's like one partition is like, I guess, no disease A, B, C, but you could refine it so that you get, or like, you get A and B. I mean, it's not even a partition if they can have both at the same time. And so, like, is there something about how it's stated that they have both diseases doesn't feel like that's a single hypothesis as well that is also unifying? But why doesn't that feel satisfactory? Does that make sense?
Right. So, so, you could say, oh, like for example, and actually, I think this is great. Like, look at this, guys, just come do coxi with us, right? So you're like, all right, some aliens are from the continent of Pangaea, and on Pangaea, A and B are endemic. And these aliens are coming through the spaceport, and one alien has runny nose and spots, and you're like, oh, it's a Pangaean. All of a sudden, right? Like what we've done is we've taken these two separate causes, unified them as Pangaeanism, right? And, I think also, by the way, you probably just built a theory of racism right there, right? Like, we take, it's like this person has, these three phenomena, but like, what if it's all because of the color of their skin? Got it. Ooh, that feels really good, right? So that also gets into a little bit of this, like explanation going wrong in that sense, right?
It's kind of like, how do we construct the candidate explanations? And like, that's doing a lot of the work for these things that look like mistakes or not.
So what you're getting into is the representation matters, right? Bayes' rule has no representation. The only thing that matters is the function mapping. It's like literally it's a function of two variables, right? P of X comma Y. But how do we represent that? What is the like causal network, for example, look like, right? What does the verbal representation look like? And so a big feature here is like those things actually matter, right? The underlying representations are really impacting how we do things. And again, if I were to sort of speak to the AI thing, what this is telling us is like, you want a machine that's going to get good and like help us and not kill us or whatever it is, right? You want a machine that can reflect on its representations, which is kind of what we do, right? Even if, and to pick up on Simon's point, even if that reflection is sort of intuitive and rapid, like even for me, if I say, oh, it's a Pangaean, like aliens from Pangaea, like those guys, they got A and B is everywhere there. So like, it's probably a Pangaean. Like even to me, I'm like, ooh, like, yeah, now A plus B works good. And I'm not going to try and give them the treatment for C because it's just because they're Pangaean. It's not because they have C. Like even for me, the representation, we have access to it. That access might be conscious, kind of system 2 stuff. It might be unconscious, but like we want that kind of meta reflective capacity, I think, or at least certainly what we're doing when we explain things has that reflective aspect. Yes, Nora, are you canceling me because we're running out of time?
No, object level. I'm just sort of curious whether, like the thing you said, does it seem right to say that this is actually where this starts to interact with simplicity?
Where what interacts with simplicity, sorry?
The empirical part of your Bayesian construct with like the theoretical simplicity stuff, like my choice for how to represent my hypothesis.
Right. I think that's right. So, for example, and Zach and I play with this a little bit, right? Like take the example of the Pangaean, right? The alien who's like got A and B because they're from the continent of Pangaea. So if you actually look at that representation, you've got Pangeanness causing disease A and disease B. Disease A causes runny nose, disease B causes spots, right? So that's a pretty complicated diagram at that point, right? So that, let's say that has lower simplicity than a diagram where it's like, oh, they just have C and that causes the two symptoms, right? So this diagram now has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 nodes as opposed to just 3 nodes, right? So, but that diagram actually has the same level of co-explanation, right? So even though the representation is complicated, so that's kind of harming the, let me put my pointer up here, that's kind of harming the simplicity value. It's actually, the co-explanation is high. So when I say, oh, it's a Pangean, I've raised co-explanation, I haven't actually helped simplicity yet, right? Because if you actually ask, like, you ask the immigration officer at the spaceport, why did you think, oh, they have, why did you diagnose them as A and B? It's like, well, they're from Pangea, and Pangeans often get A, and they also often get B, and A cause, right? You can see the explanation is still very long. In fact, it's longer than just saying, oh, he picked up A and B, because now I have to have this little Pangean story as well. So that's the case where you can start seeing them tease apart. Let me give another example, then I'm going to jump into stuff. Zach and I we had a blast, right? Because once you have a theory, then you have all these objects, right? So it's like, you have alchemy, and now you can, invent Jungian analysis. So we had all these great things. We're like, look, we can actually start talking about a bunch of psychological phenomena and even sort of statistical phenomena. So things like concision, unification, validity, this thing called consilience, that, well, actually I'll talk about a little bit in a moment, as a kind of really deep phenomena that is a source of both satisfying explanations, and then to hook into Auror's question, right, also potentially a normative principle. One of the things we see is this idea that these explanatory values aren't always in sympathy, right? So we have, for example, like, you take your empirical values, you take your theoretical values, and sometimes these things kind of battle against each other in ways that it's like, oh, I can increase, for example, like take the alien example we just gave, we can increase co-explanation by talking about Pangea, but that actually is now hurting simplicity, right? And it may actually even be hurting descriptiveness, right? Because maybe Pangeans are actually quite rare, right? There aren't that many Pangeans who pass through the spaceport, but because of that, like, I can make this diagnosis. I'd be like, oh, they're some of those people, right? Like, just as an example, like, I'm not Jewish, but like occasionally on the internet, like, anti-Semites are like, who's this Jew, right? It's like, it's a rare condition, right, that gets overdiagnosed in part because it's co-explanatory. Like, how do I make sense of this guy with curly hair who's doing physics? Like, oh, Jew, right? That kind of explanation is it's co-explanatory. It happens to be false, right? It's co-explanatory. It's not simple, right? A lot of pieces going in there. Daniel, you have your hand up again.
Yeah, just a clarifying question.
Yeah.
The descriptiveness and co-explanation, what are the XI? I know what X is. X is like the thing, like some fact, and E is an explanation.
Yeah,
but what are the XI?
I is labeling the different pieces of evidence. So like X sub I, like X1 is like, oh, he's got curly hair. X2 is, oh, he did a PhD in physics. Like X3
is X one of these pieces, or is X like the vector of the, like the set of?
Yeah, like X is the vector. Yeah, sorry. I mean, this is all very folk notation. If you take a look at the paper, hopefully we take it through a little slower there. Let me just do one last thing, and this is since Nora's seen this. This is the final. If you can get this question right, you have an IQ that is the highest possible IQ we can reliably measure. This is I think it's the last question on Raven's progressive matrices. So this is, I think, an example of how tightly linked explanation is to, the phenomenon of explanation is linked to things we care about, like we measure, for example, intelligence. So you can see this grid here. There's 8 objects in this grid. The question is, what goes in the final spot there, right? And in fact, you're given, here are the options, right? So you have to say, how do you complete this pattern, right? So this is kind of a fun game. This is the 34th question. I can't remember if there's 34 or 35 questions on Ravens, right? If you can successfully figure out which of these options is the correct one, then your IQ is like officially above 140. If you can't do it, don't worry, right? Because you practiced on a whole bunch of them before you get to the final question. The practicing, of course, is about tuning your priors. right? So when you play this game, you're basically trying to adapt yourself to the priors of the experimenter. Here is sort of the rule, right? So this is the rule you're meant to infer. Another way to think about this is the rule that is explaining why the thing looks the way it does, right? And so basically it's like you look along each column and you look along each row and you can see, oh, like there's like an equal sign kind of thing, and there's like a kind of C-shaped thing, and there's kind of a Z-shaped thing, and then there's dots, right? And you've got to have like, you know, each row and column has one of each. And so then you say, okay, if I follow that, this is the correct answer here. So this is kind of a nice example of explanation and prediction kind of entering a loop where your first step is, can I explain what I'm seeing with the 8 objects? And the second thing is like, okay, how good is my explanation, right? Well, can I successfully predict what this guy in the United Kingdom in the 1960s thought was like the smart person answer, right? So a lot of things going on there. I've talked to folks about this, like a good friend of mine, Patrick's a philosopher. He can't do these, right? This guy's a genius, right? He can't do these. And it's because his, let's say his domain priors are kind of wrong. And another way to say that is his domain priors, what he thinks of as a good explanation is not what the guy who set up this test thought was a good explanation. So this is kind of an example here of like how explanations, the ways in which they kind of permeate our notion of, in fact, very notion of intelligence itself. Here's some, I mentioned this idea of explanations being kind of multi-scale, right? So let me give one final example of explanation and how values kind of shift from one end of the spectrum to the other. So here's an example, like you're new in the office, right? You see, you start a new job, right? And you see James and Jane, they're in the office with you, right? You see James and Jane one afternoon leaving the movie theater together, right? And then a few days later, you notice that they've both taken vacation days at the same time, right? So you might just say recreationally or whatever, like, can you explain this? Explain this, right? And the first question is like, why would you want to explain this? You find this for some reason, humans are interesting. These sort of events kind of strike you in some way, right? So how do you explain this? Well, you might think of like on the axis, and this is purely empirical values. On the axis, like on one extreme, you have this kind of descriptive explanation, which is like, they both like superhero movies and it's July and people take vacations. That's what people do in July, right? They take vacations. So that's kind of a descriptive explanation. Like the other extreme is like they're having an affair. I know it, right? Like they're secretly they're dating, right? Whether you find which one of these you tend to tilt towards, like on the left-hand side, it's like it's a world of like the coincidences, kind of biologists think this way, On the other extreme, right, this is like hidden causes, unifying theories, explanatory narratives, like sort of hidden secrets that make sense of things. So let's now jump in. We'll jump into, and it looks like, Nora, we're going to have 15 minutes here. So I'm going to probably just get to explanations. We can unfold more of this as time goes on in the discussion, if you like talk about argument making, but it looks like we have people who are interested in explanations in and of themselves. So here is an explanatory value that people noticed. And in fact, it was not until very recently that we started to ask about explanation. Thinking about what explanation is actually, it's older than psychology, but not much older. Psychology is like 120 years old at this point, roughly, maybe 150 if you push it. But this is one of the first books in the philosophy of science, and it's by a guy called William Whewell. So that's how you pronounce his name. It's not Whewell, it's Whewell. Whewell was, among many things, he was a friend of Charles Babbage. A wonderful book called The Philosophical Breakfast Club, in which he appears quite commonly. So he's there a lot. He was a very, very bright guy. He ended up being master of Trinity College, Cambridge, which is a very good college in Cambridge. There's Whewell Court. And yes, if you go to Cambridge and you say, oh, can I see the statue of William Whewell? They will laugh at you, as they laughed at me. And then they will tell you it's pronounced Whewell, and they will take you to see the statue of Whewell. So Whewell, he's coming like science. When Whewell's writing, science is like not 200 years old. If we date the beginning of modern science to 1660 or so, the foundation of the Royal Society. So the kind of systematic investigation of Francis Bacon writes a kind of theory of science. He calls it the new organon, a way like the new post-Aristotelian way of reasoning. So he sets this up. Bacon also writes a science fiction novel called New Atlantis, sort of like Neil Stephenson writes an anthem. Like Bacon writes a science fiction book called New Atlantis. Then a bunch of nerds get together and like, let's make it real. So they make it real. It's called the Royal Society. That maybe 40 years after he writes the book, the Royal Society kicks off the scientific revolution, basically. Really good question is standard of living doesn't rise for another 100 years. So they invent science and it takes 100 years for us to see that crazy spike in standard of living. So one question is like that first 100 years, why was it not kicking in? In any case, it's kicked in for Whewell. So Whewell he's sitting there and he's like, science, it's great. Like, and then he's like, what the fuck, right? Like, how is this working? Like, we're all kind of doing this. We sort of have a vibe, like we're all feeling the science vibe. It's a couple of generations old. We sort of know what's going on, but he's like, what are the general principles here? And so what he does is he writes 2 books. It's the history and the philosophy of the inductive sciences. Partly it's historical because he's like, what happened? And then secondly, it's like philosophical, like what were the normative principles, right? And so he goes back and he's like, okay, what were the great major successes in science that we had? And could we extract sort of general principles of reasoning that guided those scientists in what they were doing? Right? Can we sort of look at it and be like, okay, yes, we're really happy with Newtonian gravity. What were the kind of heuristics, and we call them heuristics and biases? What were the things that what were the gut feelings that we had, right? So in fact, he tells a story, he invents this phrase consilience. So he tells a story about a certain kind of explanatory value that he sees permeating the best science, right? So in fact, his example, he gives a couple examples. This is a really nice one of a historical development in what we call it optics, right? So here's a phenomenon. He calls it colors of thin plate. So this is like just something you see, right? Something you see. You know this when you see motor oil on a puddle, right? And it makes that iridescent kind of rainbow color. And it's like, okay, you can explain this now. You know, if you don't, look it up on YouTube, right? It's like, well, that's really weird. Like I take oil isn't rainbow and water's not rainbow, but I put a drop of oil on the water and like, what? Like it's rainbows, right? So how did this happen? So they actually had a theory for this, and it was called the doctrine of alternate fits, right? And so this was like an explanation, right? At the same time, they had a different phenomena, which was what they called fringes of shadows. You and I know this today as the double slit experiment, but they didn't have that, right? So they were just like fringes of shadows. So they also had a theory for that. It was called the doctrine of interferences, right? And at some point, right? So you have, here you have an X and you have a T, right? You have a phenomena, you have an explanation. At some point, somebody realized that the doctrine of interferences, even though it hadn't been designed to do so, could also explain colors of thin plates, right? And he's like, on that basis, because of that, the emergence of that red arrow, we came to believe the doctrine of interferences more. We increased our belief in doctrine of interferences because we discovered it could explain a new and unexpected phenomena, right? So, and he's like, that's good, do this. You see this? Like, you see how we believe this? Because it's like, do that. Now, to be really clear, this is insane, right? Like, you might say, of course, that's what you do. He's pointing out that actually, this is a really weird epistemic move, right? Simply because something can explain 2 things as opposed to 1 thing doesn't make it more likely to be true, right? And you can certainly think of situations in which this is going to be false, right? And if you can't think of one, like you can just literally sit down and design one, right? But he points out, like, as an empirical fact, people who did this, people who had this bias, did really good. So this is like people like fringes and colors are having an affair, like that kind of like insane, like conspiracy theoretic reasoning actually served us extraordinarily well. So we spent some time, we got really interested in this. And we actually so we got the data, this is kind of fun. We got the data from the Royal Society. So the Royal Society is, it has something called Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, which you can still publish in today. It's a good journal, not the best journal anymore, but for 200 years, it was the only journal, basically. There were, like, the French sort of had something, but then they had these revolutions. It was tough to keep going. This was the only journal. So actually, all of the great science is published in one place over a long period of time. The other thing that's quite fun, actually, is that a lot of really shitty science is also in here. So there's, like, you can read papers in philosophical transactions, and it's like Cows, do they cause earthquakes? Like an investigation, right? So there's some really bad stuff, but there's also some really good stuff, including, actually, amusingly enough, Bayes' theorem is in here. So what's this graph showing? So this is one of these network diagrams. Each of the nodes here is quote unquote an idea. So how do we track ideas in the journal? What we do is we look at patterns of word usage, and actually they tend to sort of track underlying concepts pretty well. The size of the circle is how much that idea is being invoked in the course in this period here. This is like the first 50 years or so. The lines between ideas are ideas being linked together reliably. So when you see a line between two ideas, that means that people are writing papers where those two ideas tend to co-occur, right? So look at this here. This is 1660 to 1720. The thing you see right away is like, there's some ideas, right? Some ideas are more or less popular, and there's some lines, but there's not too many lines. So that's 1660, 1720. Let's go to the next 50 years or so. This is 1720 to 1780, right? The locations are the same. What you can just compare these two, right? What you can see is there are, like, roughly speaking, there are more lines. What's going on here is people are starting to put ideas together, to write papers in which ideas are connecting together. I'm proud to say this basically starts in 1720. The first paper in, and we did a change point detection on this, right? So you can actually see, like, as the journal people are writing, you ask, like, when do these lines start appearing? And the answer is, like, January 1720. It's the same issue where Ben Franklin's kite experiment's published. And Franklin's kite experiment is actually a great example of a consilient story where he's actually connecting two phenomena, sparks and lightning. And he's like, look, we can co-explain them. Here's 1780 to 1890, so it's the end of our data. I've labeled the nodes here. And what you can see at this point is this enormous construction of scientific explanation. So each of these nodes here are ideas, they're either phenomena or theories, and you can see the extent to which these are reliably being connected together. I've labeled some of the ideas. This one's kind of fun. You can see, my pointer's not working here, but you can see, like, there, you see the mathematics quadrant, there's mathematics, you see kinematics, right? This is mathematical theory of kinematics. You see this mining, and then, like, there's this weird node that's just sitting there that's like in between kinematics and mining. And it's like, what is this? And the answer is it's ballistics, right? So like early rocketry. So why? Because, like, what's the theory of blowing stuff up? Most of the time we were blowing stuff up because we're putting holes in the ground. And so, like, the first papers are getting written to be like, what if instead of blowing holes in the ground, we, like, blew something up under something else and it went into the air? Like, what would that be? That's like a rocket, right? So lots of really fun things here. One thing, actually, you can zoom in on this. Here, physicists, you can see that by 1890, they've realized that electricity and magnetism are having an affair. But they haven't worked out that electricity and magnetism are light. Like, they haven't actually realized that light waves are an electromagnetic phenomenon. So there should be this link. You can actually see they almost have it. So we actually maybe have like a 30-year prediction horizon. Like, we can actually project forward and see, like, look, somebody's forming this thing. So this is kind of fun. We talk about this a little bit, the greatness, this is the normative aspect, the greatness of this explanatory vibe, right? Electricity and magnetism, we co-explain them, right? We have all these phenomena, sparks, cat's fur, compasses, currents. We can co-explain them with electromagnetism. And in fact, at this point, we now push this really far, and we can unify really bizarre phenomena that shouldn't have anything to do with electricity and magnetism, right? Under what we now call the electroweak theory. I only have a few more moments. So what I'm going to do quickly is point towards explanation going wrong. So I'm going to talk just briefly about when explanatory values become explanatory vices. This is a new field in philosophy called, someone's called it vice epistemology, which I kind of love, right? It's the sort of vices of reasoning. So one of the things that we have, this is a great example, is what we might overvalue descriptiveness, right? We might have explanations that are pretty good, but we want them to explain everything. So I'll give you an example. This comes from the Oklahoma City bombing in the 1990s. So just to give you a brief sort of background, in 1995, I think it was, Timothy McVeigh, white supremacist, like literally it's just like, it's exactly the way it sounds. Timothy McVeigh, white supremacist. He wants to trigger a race war. And so what he's going to do, his plan is he's going to blow up the federal building, the federal government building in Oklahoma City. So he builds a fertilizer bomb, gets a U-Haul truck, builds a fertilizer bomb, and drives it into the basement of the building. Here it is. He drives into the basement of the building and triggers it remotely, and it blows up. And in fact, the bomb turns out to be way more powerful than he expected or anybody expected. You can see it tore this entire building apart. The bomb was so powerful, actually, that many people died who weren't in the building because the shards of glass were propelled out with such force that they were like stabbed. People were stabbed to death by flying shards of glass, like elsewhere in the town. It was horrifying. So McVeigh does this, right? And in fact, actually, it's kind of a stunning thing. So he does this, and he's got what the kids would call OPSEC, right? He's actually like, he's rented a U-Haul truck. He's like hidden, he's built this in secret. Nobody knows he hasn't told anybody really. No one knows he's gonna do this, right? He drives the truck into the basement, he blows it up. And he's already gone when it goes off, and he's driven away, and he's like, he's clever. He's parked his car far away from any cameras, right? So that's great. So okay. So the next day, Timothy McVeigh gets in his car, and he gets on the highway, and his car doesn't have license plates. He's taken the license plates off his car for some reason, right? And he's driving down the highway in a car with no license plates, and he's speeding, right? And he has an unregistered gun on the passenger seat of the car. So he gets pulled over, right? So he gets pulled over by the police. Police pull him over for speeding without license plates. Like, this guy is like obvious, right? They pull him over. They arrest him for having an unregistered firearm. And he's in jail for 3 days before they realize he's the guy who did the Oklahoma City bombing. Like, he's been arrested just purely for, like a gun law violation. So you think about this, and it's like, this makes no sense. Like, this guy pulled off this incredibly sophisticated terrorist attack. No one knew who it was, right? Like, he, incredibly intelligent man, right? And then, like, what an idiot, right? Like, even I know, like, don't drive a car without license plates on the back, because the police are going to see you and they're going to pull you over, because that's just illegal, and it's like an easy pull, right? And if you're going to do that, don't get on the highway where there's cops. Like, if you're going to stick on the back roads, and if you're going to do that on the highway, don't speed, right? And if you're going to speed without license plates on the highway, like, hide the gun that you have that's unlicensed, right? So this doesn't, okay, so how do we explain this? Well, the answer is people are complicated, right? People are weird. And you know what? Timothy McVeigh, he's just a complicated guy, right? So the problem is this is sort of unlikely given the explanation. The explanation is like, yes, it's a bit tricky to explain this under the standard thing. But you're a conspiracy theorist, not a problem, because Timothy McVeigh didn't do it. He was actually a patsy for a secret government conspiracy. And in fact, so they can actually account for the facts better, right? Timothy McVeigh didn't do the bombing. It was actually a whole network of secret government agents, right? McVeigh was a moron, right? Who they just pinned it on him. And of course he's a moron. Like, look at him. He's driving like on the highway, speeding on the highway without license plates. Of course he's an idiot. He doesn't know what's going on. He's just a complete, right? So in fact, the conspiracy theory can account for the facts better, right? As a Bayesian, like, not to make fun of Bayesians, right? Like, the conspiracy theory people are actually better Bayesians, right? Like, they can account for the strange they can account for the strange behavior of Timothy McVeigh in a way that the standard thing, you basically have to say, look, people are complicated. It's hard to say, right? Yeah, it's unlikely that somebody that, that precise would then do something so unprecise, but people are funny, right? Another example, this is co-explanation being overvalued. This is the Reddit map of the QAnon belief network, right? You sort of zoom in here, right? So in QAnon, right, everything is connected to everything, right? So like every single phenomena, like, the background of like a frame in the movie 2001 is like somehow connected to like the, Nikola Tesla's theory of electromagnetic propulsion, right? Like everything is connected for the QAnon people. And part of the game, and actually a colleague of mine has talked about QAnon as gamified conspiracy, right? The pleasure in QAnon, and people do in fact derive pleasure from this, is in sort of linking together and co-constructing explanations. I'll tell you, if we have a little time in the Q&A, I will tell you about my induction to a conspiracy theory. It's called the Sovereign Citizens Movement. So if we have time in the Q&A, I will tell you my sovereign citizen story, which happened in Santa Fe. Let me just play out this co-explanation gone awry here. here's your two facts, right? Meticulous bombing in Oklahoma City. The guy who supposedly did it is caught speeding without license plates, right? So the standard explanation says, look, he did it and people are weird. Like they're kind of unpredictable. Like people do low probability, bizarre stuff. Sorry, right? But okay, here's the one that works. It's the false flag operation, right? So the government actually, it wasn't McVeigh who did this. The government actually attacked itself in order to crack down on civil liberties. Okay, but now you got this problem. Like really, like the journalists didn't see anything. Like there's a false flag operation. All these newspaper reporters show up. Like nobody kind of felt it was weird. Like why didn't they kind of feel something was off? Well, the journalists are in on it, right? And of course that makes sense because it's a false flag, right? So the journalists are bought off, right? The cops didn't see anything. Well, actually, and this is part of the theory, like there was a cop who did say there's something weird about this bombing. And like the next week he was found dead, right? So like one died, right? Okay, so I guess like, and of course the standard explanation is like, look, sometimes people are suicidal and they kill themselves, right? Like it just so happened accidentally, this cop did say something was weird about this bombing. This felt like something more than just a lone wolf operation. It felt like the government was involved in covering stuff up. And like the next week, the guy kills himself. How do we explain that? Well, look, people have problems, right? It's sad. But no, we can explain that, which is like one guy, he was killed because, of course, it was a fault. Like, so the FBI turns out is hiring contract killers, right? So this network is constantly ramifying, right? In order to make sense of this chunk here, you actually start to fill out this entire space, right? So in order to satisfy this kind of, in order to get this kind of satisfying explanation here, and this is one of our theories, and I'll now and finish in a moment, I'll talk very briefly about some of the sociology we've done about this. So you can do sociology of science, you can also do sociology of crazy people. So this is with Chloe Perry, who's now she's now doing her PhD at Michigan in American Studies. So we started to think about what happens, like say you start explaining things this way, like what happens to you in your life? And so we talked about something called an epistemic counter community. So epistemic counter community, these are groups, online groups, maybe offline groups, very commonly online, that you might say they encourage bad explanatory values, right? They ratify and validate certain kinds of explanations, right? They also at the same time provide a lot of the kind of things we desire from communities, right? I will say, this is, don't cancel me, right? But like epistemic counter communities are pretty common, right? We notice them when they get extreme, like we notice epistemic counter communities like QAnon, we notice conspiracy theory groups. But I might encourage you to think about groups that you might be a part of that are epistemic counter communities, meaning the epistemology of these groups is so weird that you find yourself in opposition to normie society, right? If you are a member of a group where like you are valuing and making explanations and explaining the world in ways that normal people would find weird, and not just weird, but somehow like kind of excluding you from reasonableness, right? You are a member of an epistemic counter community. Whether or not that's good, I'm not going to say. Somebody once said that the secret here is don't avoid cults, just join many of them, right? These epistemic communities can get very strange though, and particularly with these epistemic counter communities when they become conspiracy theories, it's very hard to get people out of them. Right. So we've studied a group called the Red Pill. It exists on Reddit. People have a great deal of difficulty once they get quote unquote sucked into them. In part because there's a kind of feedback loop between the epistemology of the group, the social benefits of being part of the group. The other thing that happens, and this is sort of sad, right, is as you enter or sort of sign on to very strange explanatory values, one of the things you find is that we notice is that people actually become alienated from their ordinary social groups. And why, right? Why should having weird explanations alienate you from other people? One reason I think is that actually most of what we do in life is explain things. Most of our social lives is sitting around like, sports ball, right? It's like, oh, the Penguins lost today. Why did the Penguins lose? Like, oh, let's explain it, right? Like everybody explains. That's mostly what we do like day to day. Like, how was your day? Well, you first give some facts and then you try and make sense of them together over a beer or coffee, right? With these groups, I think one of the things that happens, the reason that people end up isolated is that the kinds of explanations they get good at, the kinds of explanations they learn to value, are increasingly sort of non-normative and alienating from ordinary social life, right? So the red pill group we studied, a lot of the explanations have a certain kind of gender ideology associated with them. If you sign on to one of these groups, right, you'll find yourself valuing explanations that your friends in ordinary life don't value. And you'll find them making explanations that you think aren't, valid, right? So you sort of slowly get drawn away. I have hit my time limit. So what I'm going to do here is sort of pause for a moment. I've talked a little bit. I'll summarize where I am, and then we can do Q&A. And I'm here until 2 p.m. my time. So that's 7 p.m. UK time and 8 p.m. Prague time. So I'm here for a while, but let me just give you a sort of short story about where we are. The main message of this talk is, let's think about what we do when we explain things, right? Let's broaden our perspective. Think of human existence, think of human reasoning, think of automated machines as doing more than solving a prediction task. What they're doing is potentially solving an explanation task. We may be spending a lot of time retrospectively explaining things, right? So take, for example, everyone loves this stuff, the free energy principle, active inference, predictive coding, right? This is focused around, something's happening, what's going to happen next. My claim here is that actually as human beings, both intuitively, subconsciously, and at increasing levels of cultural sophistication, we're not doing prediction. Everything on the screen here, nothing you see on the screen here has anything to do with predicting what's going to happen next, right? It has everything to do with explaining what's happened and fighting and battling over which explanations are the ones we want to sign on to, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is like these things are called explanatory values. Explanatory values vary a great deal. We discover explanatory values that work for us, right? So this is William Whewell being like, wow, science, fuck yeah, like what happened? Maybe the answer is consilience. And then finally, I've gestured a little bit at this, at the epistemology of things like conspiracy theories, where explanatory values kind of go off the rails, right? People sign on to explanations of the way things are. The values underlying those explanations are sufficiently deviant from, we use this phrase, normie values, right? That people find themselves increasingly isolated from the communities that would otherwise be providing either reality checks or indeed just general human life, social support, right? If any of you have friends who are young men who have signed on to incel, right, stories, one of the things you find is they're really tedious, right? Because everything goes back to this weird set of incel explanations. These occur on the right wing, the left wing, even if those phrases make sense anymore. So this is kind of an open question here for us as cognitive scientists and social scientists is, can we understand the values and how those values get magnified and distorted in different ways? So that's where we are. I noticed there was a hand up from Aurora, but I'm happy to take questions, and Nora can also shut us down and as she pleases. So maybe I should ask Nora, where should we go? Should we do questions? What do you want to do?
Questions sounds good. So I suggest, let's open it up, and I leave it to you, Simon, mostly for the time being, to sort of take the questions as you want, organically. We'll see where we end up.
I can see, I just briefly caught the chat there. So I see Aurora, so please raise your hand even if you're shy, and I promise not to be a monster, so you should feel free to vocalize. But Aurora, you're up. What's on your mind?
Firstly, this is really good. Really enjoyed it. A lot to read. I actually did my PhD in misinformation and social networks.
Oh.
So,
okay, there you go. Yeah.
More things I want to go read now, which I'm very excited about. I have 2 questions. Pick whichever one you think is most interesting. One is, what is this theory of explanations that you've got not explained very well about humans? Right. About the way that we actually make decisions, so we actually explain things. And secondly, you hinted at earlier something about moral explanations. I'm working on moral reasoning for PIPS, so I'm kind of selfishly curious to hear a bit more about where your work went there.
That's great. So, yeah, no, these are both great questions, right? So, one of the things that we're really interested in the lab right now is trying to understand the relationship between language and explanation, language and argument making. And in fact, a lot of what we're trying to hook into here is the fact that, like, look at these diagrams, right? I've got nodes and they have these shorthand labels and they have arrows, right? This is how we represent models in science, but it's not, I think these are not really the representations that are sitting in people's heads, right? So this is this question of what are the representations of, like, how do we actually represent explanations to ourselves, right? What do those representations look like? And they're going to look funny. They're going to look surprising and strange. And I don't yet know how to map those representations onto the kinds of frameworks we've talked about. Take the alien disease example, right? That Labroso's lab came up with. I think it's lovely, right? The thing there is we've short-circuited a lot of the complexity by being like, all right, here are the 2 symptoms. Here are the 3 diseases. You know, we've actually kind of carved that space up in a way, like we've kind of pre-carved it for people so that we can study a certain aspect. But in a sense, we kind of impose the representation onto people. But a big question for us is, of course, like, I'm just constantly, like, I got sense data flowing in all the time. It's not chopped down for me. God doesn't say, hey, Simon, there's 7 things happening right now, and there's 3 theories and pick one, right? No, right? I'm actually sense making in a far more fluid and tricky sense. And I don't think we understand how that's happening, right?
We also,
so
I would also offer we also filter information pretty selectively as well. So like you're choosing the XIs in some sense as well. And we can reject them, and we can also search for them actively as well. So I think there's certainly an element of confirmation bias, which I haven't heard you talk about much in the course of the talk. Which I'm curious to see if that fits in somewhere in your theory.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, you know, belief formation is, you know, fundamental. Quite like, how do people form beliefs, right? What we're looking at here is how do people form explanations, right? Which is a sort of, like, you might think of as a deeper form of belief, right? Kind of something that structures a bunch of other beliefs. But yeah, what we consider worthy of explanation, what we try to explain is, you know, a big question. A lot of progress in science, for example, comes from the need to explain things that nobody thought needed explaining, right? So, you know, in astrophysics, for example, here's something you have to explain. Why isn't night the same as day? Like, why isn't the night sky as bright as the daylight sky? And the answer is, well, there's no stars there. But if you actually try to puzzle that out, you realize, oh, that implies the universe is either not infinite or not eternal, right? So realizing there are things you need to explain you didn't think you needed to explain, like, absolutely, right? The evaluation there is really about what's salient. The moral stuff, to go to your next question, I think is really, really good question. We know very little, like, when moral evaluations and let's call them epistemic evaluations, we know that they're pretty tightly connected in the sort of system 1 intuitive sense. And so we're doing some work right now about people talking about what's possible. And you can see people mix what's possible and what's permissible, right? So what can you do versus what are you allowed to do, or what ought you to do? So for example, if you ask children, is it possible to take a bath with your shoes on? They say no. Okay, they're wrong. You can take a bath with your shoes on. What is this? The world's not going to explode, right? It's like, you know, it's not a black hole's not going to form before you do this, right? But they're confusing permissiveness, social norms, with kind of physical possibility. And I think my guess is the more we understand about moral explanation, the more we're going to see commonalities between these things. So for example, right, think about co-explanation, right? We value an explanation more when it links together phenomena, when it makes this phenomena dependent upon this one, right? My sense is we're going to find similar phenomena. The moral explanations, the moral reasoning people prefer is when it links together things. Like, we don't like moral rules where what's moral for this context in this situation, or rather the explanation for this thing, is disconnected from the explanation for that thing, right? The most extreme case here is someone like Peter Singer, right? Peter Singer can explain everything, right? It's like moral value attaches to consciousness, or whatever it is, right? And from that, you can derive how we eat, how we ought to eat, how we ought to treat babies, how we ought to treat the elderly, how we ought to consider the birth rate. Like, all of those things are linked together under a fundamental moral principle, right? This may be why the Singer kind of utilitarianism is so appealing to people. Another example is John Rawls, right? Rawls has a different theory. It's basically, it's the notion of justice as fairness, right? And again, it's a very simple thing from which everything else derives. Very different from an earlier set of moral theories, you might call them virtue ethics, which had very specific accounts, like what it meant to be a good scientist was very different from what it meant to be a good father or mother, right? Whereas for Peter Singer, like everything is derivative of that, right? What it means to be a good father, what it means to be a good scientist, fundamentally are all about augmenting whatever the pleasures of consciousness. I don't quite know Singer stuff, but so you can see there, you start to see how we might judge moral reasoning, how we might judge moral theories is connected to how we might judge explanations for, why the world looks the way it does, as opposed to why we feel the world ought to be the way it is or is not. I see, yeah, of course. Thank you, Aurora. So I see TJ has a hand up and then Simon. So we'll do that order. Unless TJ is accidentally has their hand up.
No. Okay, so I think like in the abstract of the talk, you had also mentioned something about Reddit changed my mind and LessWrong 2.0. I'm curious to check how did those forums hold on your like account of explanatory values and like the play between all those different explanatory values.
Great, thank you, DJ. So did not get to the depths here, but let me sort of give you a little preview. You can also take a look at the paper, which is a lot of fun. I like to think. So this is work with Robin Noss. Robin's now just starting at MIT. He's starting at MIT and the PhD in the fall. So explanations. Everything I've done here is sort of internal, right? What I've shown you here is an account of what it's like to be a person judging explanations. What we haven't talked about is the social aspect, and we didn't get around to is the social aspect, right? So we haven't looked at, for example, the way in which I might talk you round to becoming a conspiracy theorist. What we're looking at here is why conspiracy theories, once they're adopted, might feel satisfying. But we haven't looked at the ways in which, I might introduce you to a conspiracy theory or maybe talk you out of a conspiracy theory, right? We spent some time looking at how people, so this is argument making. So it's different from explaining, right? I explain the world, but I make an argument to you, right? So argument is kind of dyadic counterpart to the monadic explanation story. The short version on this, which actually turned out to be really interesting, is we looked for sort of styles of argument making, do some automated extraction of patterns of argument making. You see, for example, people make probabilistic arguments. People say, oh, it's more likely that this is true than that. People make deductive arguments, right? Like if A, then B, right? It's sort of kind of a logical, deductive, certainty-based thing. People say, well, look, you can't prove this, or you can prove that, or it's so on. We can actually, not only can we look at the patterns of argument, we can also look at like how much people like them. So in Reddit Changed My View, people can flag arguments as having changed their view, which is quite fun. On LessWrong, we can watch people make arguments to each other. We can look at the upvotes. One of the things we find consistently, and this is across subjects, so it's like whatever people are arguing about, it's a bit disappointing, perhaps, at least people find it disappointing. People really like arguments that refer to personal experience. So, the arguments that are things that say things like, look, in my experience, X, or here's what I've seen, Y, those arguments tend to be rated much more highly than arguments about what's more or less likely, than arguments that sort of rely on deductive reasoning. That's a sort of, kind of a preview of that. There's a really good question sitting in there. Why are those the arguments that work, right? And I don't know, I have some good explanations for it. But anyway, that's a bit of a preview, TJ. I don't know if that's helpful to you as like the world's fastest introduction to the second part of a talk that maybe Nora can have us back next year to pick up. Simon, you have your hand up, and then Nora.
Yes.
Simon. Oh yeah, there. Good. Yeah.
Yeah. So Bas van Frassen has a quote which I love about explanation. He says, the discussion of explanation went wrong at the very beginning when explanation was conceived of as a relation like description, a relation between a theory and a fact. Really, it is a three-term relation between theory, fact, and context. So like this is so for people not familiar with Van Frassen, he's a scientist and philosopher of science who, amongst other things, favors a pragmatic view of explanation. So when we talk about explanations, there's a kind of mistake that people often make when they think that there's an explanation for a phenomenon, rather than an explanation for a phenomenon within a particular context for particular purposes for a particular audience.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, are you looking at or considering when talking about explanations, what those explanations are meant to be for, who they're meant to be for, and what the person is trying to do with them? Or are you, as Van Frassen says, going wrong at the very beginning?
Excellent. Simon, one of the things I when I talk about causation, so I have a kind of Van Frassen-like view of causation, and just to kind of unfold what you're saying in a very particular case, right? Guy goes to a bar, gets drunk, gets in his car, drives home, hits somebody, kills them. What caused this person's death, right? And, we have this idea like, Yehuda Perl is going to say, oh, we're going to build a machine that's going to like uncover causal reasoning, right? And I think both you and I would agree, like, there's no answer, right? If you're a doctor, what caused this person's death is, blunt trauma to the skull. If you're a psychologist, what caused this person's death is the poor decision-making abilities of the man who was driving.
Yeah.
If you're a sociologist, it's drinking culture. If you're a lawyer, it's, depends, are you the defense or the prosecution? If you're the defense, it's the, the bartender who knowingly overserved this person, right? So when we ask about cause, and this is just, causation, not all explanations are causal, but many explanations are, right? Or at least when we say like, explain, how could this have happened, right? You imagine you're like standing there, yelling at God, how could this have happened, right?
Yeah.
That explanation is, it has to occur within a context, right? When we explain, it's like, can you explain why we have so many school shootings? Well, yes, we can explain in many different ways.
Yeah.
And some of those explanations are going to be trying to make sense for a parent who's lost a child. Some of those explanations are going to be trying to induce people to pass this or that piece of legislation, right? So I think you are right that in the end, explanations are fundamentally oriented towards, this phrase pragmatics is really nice, right? It's not that explanations always have clearly articulated goals, right? So like you and I might say, we're sitting down and be like, can you explain why America is so violent? Like, it's not clear what our goal is there. Like, we're not masterminds planning the world. Like, there's a lot of flex there. Our conversation could go in many different ways, right? That could actually be a conversation that ends up being about history or about cultures. It could be about, all sorts of things. So I think my sense here is that those kind of goal-setting agendas are part of how we accept or reject explanations. They're part of what's in the domain. You can still look at explanatory values, right, in isolation from the goals themselves, right? Any particular goal is going to have a set of explanations that are compatible with the goal, but worse or less along this kind of epistemic value dimension, as well as on this more kind of goal-oriented dimension. So I kind of want to argue that there are multiple axes here. We can look along one, but at the same time, I will say you're right, Simon. Like, we have collapsed the purposeful aspect of explanations. In part, let me just scroll all the way back, and then we'll take another question here. So if I scroll all the way back, if you look at these here, right, a lot of these questions have context, right? Why is my partner upset this evening, for example? Like, this is a question that if you bring it to a relationship counselor, is going to look really different from if you have it, with your partner themselves, right? Because the goals are going to be really, really different, right? In one case, the explanation might be more oriented around solving a problem. In the other case, it might be more oriented around like a deeper understanding and relating to the person. So I love this. I think you added something really important here, which is this kind of mysterious goal dimension, right? It comes up even like I mentioned this case about, children saying, oh, you can't take a bath with your shoes on. really, depending on the context, you can or you can't, right? Like it's, it is possible relative to some goals, but not relative to other goals. Juan, am I saying your name right? I see you have your hand up.
Oh, it's Shen actually.
Shen. Okay, Shen. Yes. Hello. Yeah.
Right. First, yeah. Thanks for I know I only called it and I unfortunately missed up the time. But thanks for really interesting, I think, talk. And I briefly looked at the paper, so I have a rough, sense of like, I think it's a really compelling account of, like trying to understand explanations in terms of like various aspects of Bayesian inference, right? Explanatory values as various aspects of Bayesian inference. And I'm curious, as someone who works in Bayesian cognitive science, like, when you were going towards like describing how this can account for, the formation of like conspiracy theories and epistemic counter communities, it strikes me that this might also like offer a pretty compelling account of like maybe like a Bayesian cognitive science view of like ideology, like broadly speaking, right? Because I think I think philosophers of ideology have like written about like what it means, like what ideology is, right? This is like system of interlocking beliefs that justify existing practices and norms, and they sort of like often like internally coherent in some way, right? And this to me, like I'm curious, like whether you thought about that or like what sort of purchase the work you've been doing like might offer to explain those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question. So we've done some work on the red pill. I mentioned this briefly. So the red pill is an online conspiracy theory. It's connected to the incel ideology. So this was a really fun case for us because it is an ideology. And of course, we have to say, well, first of all, what is an ideology? One answer is an ideology. I have a theory, you have an ideology, right? Ideology is like shitty theory. But I think you made a very good point, right? It's not just it's not just a theory, and it's not just a theory that interlocks with lots of beliefs and fits things together and makes sense of the world, but it's also connected to behavior. And so one of the big questions for ideology is what's this cyclic feedback loop between explanation on the one hand and behavior on the other, right? So, an ideology for like, take the red pill is what we would call a sexist ideology, right? It's an ideology whose fundamental explanatory basis presupposes the mental inferiority of women, right? So the explanations, kind of all the explanations in the red pill come out of this idea or sort of are linked to a kind of certain explanatory tack that says women are fundamentally limited as epistemic agents, as moral agents, right? So, but for it to become an ideology, those explanations have to connect to behavior. So it isn't just enough for you to have the kind of sexist explanation, right? It also has to influence what you're doing in the world. And so that might be like how you treat your girlfriend, how you treat your sister, how you treat your mother, how you vote, right? So the question we have in ideology is actually which comes first, right? Because there are a lot of people who there are a lot of men who behave badly towards women, right? But who don't have, at least consciously, a sophisticated set of explanations, right? There are potentially people who have explanations who actually don't behave badly, right? There are people who have sexist explanations who behave, let's say, very well towards women, like, I don't know, Steven Pinker, right? So you have this kind of situation where you want to know which comes first, right? Does the sexist behavior come first, or do the sexist explanations come first? So we have an answer. The answer is the behavior comes first. That actually it looks like when you see people join the ideology, they come in with questions about what to do and how to act and how to behave. They often come into these groups with stories about their dating lives. They're asking questions about how do I behave in the world. If they stay, you see them enter into the explanatory mode. And so you see them in these groups, they shift from I'm trying to figure out what to do, I'm talking about what I'm doing, into I'm talking about making sense of like women as a species. I'm making sense of, and a lot of this, it ends up also being kind of racist and anti-Semitic and all sorts of crazy things happen. So the answer is, yeah, it turns out in that sense, the action aspect precedes. But of course, there is this feedback loop, right? As you explain the world, it also influences the way you behave. Somebody mentioned confirmation bias, things like that, right? You go out into the world with a presupposition that women have, women, let's say, are mentally inferior. You're going to find evidence that confirms that view simply by the way in which you're acting, right? So there's a kind of complicated loop there that, ideologies have a strong explanatory component, but they also have to have this behavioral component. in order for them to sort of qualify as ideologies, right? So one of the definitions we use is they're programmatic congeries of ideas, right, oriented towards political and group behavior. So you need to kind of have both pieces in play.
Right, thanks. That's very fascinating, and I think sort of tracks with my sort of rough understanding of like our participation in like leftist ideological spaces. Yeah, thanks.
We have a paper on the red pill. You can Google it. I mean, go on my Google Scholar, you can see this. It's called The Cognitive Science of Extremist Ideologies Online. It's really interesting because the right-wing stuff is actually really easy to spot. It's really common in part because it's countercultural. But it's really clear that ideology is not something, ideology is in lots and lots of places, right? So I noticed this, for example, when I talk to some of the AI risk people, it's like, wait a second, like the explanatory values you have here, the way in which you're organizing your entire life in a way that seems extraordinarily, what we might say, ideological, where you have explanations about the world, you have behaviors, these things are really tightly linked. And of course, it becomes salient and obvious because both the explanations and the behaviors are really counternormative, right? Like you're doing things that are very odd and visibly odd. Not saying it's right or wrong as a scientist, it's just like, it's very clear that what you have there is a community defined not just by its behaviors. And I think this is a really important point, right? Like groups are not just behaviors, they're epistemic cognitive objects as well. They have a shared set of like affordances that they work with. And so I think that's a little bit, if you wanted, memetics is this terrible phrase. It's a lot of people have pointed out, like the meme is a great idea and it's just produced no good science, sadly. But if we want to understand the relationship between idea, concept, and society, that's, I think, understanding the nexus of behavior and belief is critical. So, Nora, I see you have your hand up, and maybe you're also, again, maybe you're saying we should draw things to a close, coming up to 2 p.m. on my side here.
I'll make a mutual thing. So first, Meta sort of, I'm gonna close the recording now, and then we'll see whether I have some more time to chat or not. So